First of all, a brief word about this series. The purpose of the Dewey Lecture is to bring to the law school every year a distinguished scholar from the humanities, usually in philosophy or political theory. The first Dewey Lecture, in fact, was given by John Rawls, and it was his now famous article, The Idea of Public Reason Revisited. In the intervening years, others who have spoken in the series include Bernard Williams, Judith Jarvis Thompson, Amartya Sen, Jürgen Habermas, Hilary Putnam, Catherine McKinnon, and Peter Singer. So it's an impressive list, but it's no exaggeration to say that Korsgaard adds philosophical distinction to that company. And it's not often that we've been able to welcome a philosopher who's generally acknowledged to be one of the leading moral philosophers in the Western world. Before saying more about Korsgaard, let me also remind you that this week is Animal Welfare Week at the law school, where we've long been committed to this issue. And I'll just mention that we're the home of the Chicago Project on Animal Treatment, which has designed a food label that informs consumers about the practices involved in the raising of the animals that they're purchasing for food. And we're also now working on the ethics of animal research. More recently, we've also inaugurated a scholarship fund for a student interested in animal welfare. It's called the Perry Sunstein Fund because it commemorates Cass Sunstein's beloved companion animal, the dog Perry, but it also accepts donations commemorating other companion animals. So now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Chris back to the University of Chicago. As some of you probably don't know, Korsgaard began her career in Illinois, getting her BA from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which gave her an honorary doctorate in 2004. But her tie to our university was longer and perhaps even more crucial for her career. She taught in our philosophy department from 1983 to 1991, moving from assistant professor to full professor, which was a time during which she was just beginning to be recognized as one of the leading moral philosophers. I wasn't at Chicago during that time, but I know how important her presence was to our department and how much she's missed as a first-rate philosopher, but also as a colleague, a teacher, and friend. So it gives us all, I would say, great pleasure to welcome her back. But since I actually knew Chris well before she came to Chicago, let me go back to that time. When Chris entered the Harvard Philosophy Department in 1974, I hadn't yet begun to teach, so we overlapped very briefly in the graduate program. But then in 1975, I began teaching as an assistant professor, and Chris was actually in some of my courses, taking a keen interest in Aristotle, which is still one of her great interests. Chris at that time was a quiet person, if you can imagine that, and she didn't have a kind of flash and aggressiveness that was then quite much valued in the profession. Instead, she read Kant and she read Aristotle and she thought about the ideas contained in those texts, and then she wrote with a grace and eloquence that were and are very rare in the profession. She always burrowed down to the deepest issues, and then she framed her insights with a rare clarity. And I remember a department meeting in my second year of teaching when we were talking about candidates for a set of prestigious fellowships. And there were other aggressive flash types that were being mentioned who had, I think, little depth. And I said, well, this Christine Korsgaard, you know, she's truly impressive. And I described a couple of her papers, at which point then one senior faculty member immediately chimed in. And then at that point, then others said, well, we better go read her papers. And then they did. And everyone began to see how good she was. Well, Harvard's was a department then, as now, I think, that valued close work on historical texts, seeing this as part of how creative philosophy is done. I mean, why have a conversation with the latest journal article when you can have a conversation with Kant or Aristotle? So leading figures such as Hilary Putnam, Stanley Cavell, and especially John Rawls defended that way of doing contemporary philosophy. So Rawls, who became Chris's thesis advisor, strongly encouraged her to write a historically grounded dissertation. Because Aristotle was a part of it, I was actually on the thesis committee. And this historical approach was not immediately popular in the profession as a whole. So it's been such an enormous pleasure over the years to see it vindicated and to see how her deep and lasting and subtle work is now more and more recognized until by now, as I say, she's universally seen as one of the Western world's leading moral philosophers. She is currently Arthur Kingsley Porter Professor of Philosophy at Harvard, where she once was a humble graduate student. She not only chaired the department for 6 years, she's also been tireless as a teacher, producing a stream of graduate students who are by now themselves ensconced in leading university positions. Korsgaard's work in moral philosophy deals with foundational issues: the nature of agency, the source of normativity, the relationship between morality and rationality, the constitution of the self. Through her close study of Kant, but a study that's always illuminated by her own keen insights into the problems, she's fashioned a distinctive Kantian view in which the idea of human beings as the sources of norms through their own self-legislating power plays a central role. The two books that first stated this important view are The Sources of Normativity, 1996, and Creating the Kingdom of Ends, a collection of articles that appeared in the same year. Two more major books are now in the immediate pipeline: The Constitution of Agency, which is another collection of articles, including, I would want to point out, some papers on Aristotle that are quite wonderful, is coming out shortly here, but it's already out in the UK. And her 2002 Locke lectures, Self-Constitution, Agency, Identity, and Integrity, are forthcoming from Oxford in 2009. Korsgaard's work is full of implications for political philosophy, but she's never really written political philosophy until, I would say, her second set of Tanner lectures in 2004, which were called Fellow Creatures, Kantian Ethics and Our Duties to Animals. Here, Korsgaard, arguing that Kant's own views about duties to animals are not the best way to develop a distinctively Kantian view in this area, then sets out to do just that herself, providing a rich theory that also appropriates elements from Aristotle to yield a complex picture of our duties to promote the flourishing of all sentient beings. I say this work is political. It's developed actually as a normative ethical view, but it offers a lot of leads for those interested in law and public policy. She'll be developing aspects of this view today, so I won't say more, but I'll also only just add that Korsgaard's love of animals is thoroughly practical as well as theoretical. Anyone who looks at her website will see two very beautiful cats on display. I tried to find out more about those cats by Googling Christine Korsgaard cats, but for some reason what this brought up was a list of her campaign donations to political candidates, none of whom seemed to have any particular connection to cats, so I was frustrated in that effort. But in 2007, Korsgaard ventured further into the politics of animal treatment when she played a leading role in a campaign at Harvard to have cage-free eggs adopted in all the student dining facilities, and that campaign was successful. So without taking any more time from this remarkable occasion, I just want to welcome very warmly Christine Korsgaard to give a lecture, Interacting with Animals, a Kantian Account. So please welcome her.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be back at the University of Chicago. Let me say before I begin, you should each have a copy of a handout. I hope you do. I will not be referring directly to the handout, but it takes up the main points that I'll be talking about in the order I'll be talking about them, so you'll find that you're able to follow along if you want to do that. Light on my eye. Human beings are animals. Phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Primates, family Hominids, species Homo sapiens, subspecies Homo sapiens sapiens. According to current scientific opinion, we evolved approximately 200,000 years ago in Africa from ancestors whom we share with the other great apes. What does it mean that we're animals? Scientifically speaking, an animal is essentially a complex multicellular organism that feeds on other life forms. But what we share with the other animals is not just a definition. It's a history. That is, it's a story and a resulting set of attributes and circumstances and an ecosystem and a planet. What is the story? Well, living things are essentially homeostatic systems. They maintain themselves through a process of nutrition that enables them to work constantly at replacing the fragile materials of which they are composed. Living things also work at reproducing or contributing to the reproduction of other living things that maintain themselves in essentially the same way. To engage in those activities is essentially what it means to be alive. And in order to engage in those activities, any living thing must be in some way responsive to conditions in its environment. Plants, for instance, respond to dryness by growing deeper roots, or to sunshine by turning their leaves in its direction. Even a unicellular organism is drawn to some things and recoils from others. But once upon a time, about 600 million years ago, some of the living things on this planet became responsive in a particular way. They began to become aware of their surroundings, to form some sort of a representation of the environment in which they live. Presumably, this was because of the evolutionary advantages of such awareness, which enables a living thing to monitor the relationship between its own condition and the conditions in its environment. Perhaps there's no hard and fast line between that distinctive power we call perception and the kind of responsiveness exhibited by, say, a plant that turns its leaves towards the sun. But as responsiveness evolved into perception, something quite new began to appear in the world. Because a bare theoretical awareness of its environment all by itself could not do an organism any good. If perception is to help an organism to survive and reproduce, it must be informed or accompanied by something like motivational states. That is, the organism's awareness must be accompanied by experiences of attraction and aversion that direct its activities in ways that are beneficial to its survival and reproduction. And so the evolution of perception brought with it the capacity for negative and positive experiences, of hunger and thirst and enjoyment in satisfying them, of pain and pleasure, of fear and security. And as these organisms themselves became more complex feelings evolved out of the simpler ones, of interest and boredom, misery and delight, family or group attachment and hostility to outsiders, individual attachment, curiosity, and eventually even of wonder. Now, what all of this means is that an organism who is aware of the world also characteristically experiences the world and his own condition in a positive or negative way. That is, as something that is, in various ways, good or bad for himself or from his point of view. And so there came to be in the world living things, homeostatic organic systems, for whom things can be good or bad. The organisms who share this peculiar fate are the animals, and you and I are among them. And that gives rise to a moral question. How should we treat the others? Now, to judge by our practices, our actual moral attitudes towards the other animals are deeply unstable. On the one hand, most people believe that it's wrong to inflict pain or death on a non-human animal for a trivial reason. No one is more readily condemned than someone who kicks a dog out of anger or skins a cat for the sheer malicious enjoyment of inflicting suffering. On the other hand, human beings have traditionally counted nearly any reason other than anger or malice that we might have for hurting or killing the other animals as non-trivial and sufficient. We hurt and kill animals in order to eat them, in order to make products out of them, in order to test products out of them, products on them, because they are nuisances to us and even for sport. Our view seems to be that the other animals do count, morally speaking, but that our own human interests always take precedence over theirs, and so that their counting never actually counts. Now, what could make sense of that view? Or alternatively, what could show that it's wrong? It's a cherished belief of our species that something sets us apart from the other animals, something that is not merely a matter of degree, like intelligence, but a matter of kind. But of course, it wouldn't be sufficient to answer that question simply to show that there is such a distinctively human attribute. We would also have to show that it's morally relevant in the right way. And there are essentially two ways such a difference could be morally relevant. It would have to be connected either to the nature of the good or to the nature of right and obligation. Accordingly, there are two general types of arguments that people have used, either to try to justify or to criticize the way we treat the other animals. First, arguments based on similarities or differences in the ways that things can be good or bad for human beings, and the ways they can be good or bad for the other animals. And second, arguments based on the nature of right and obligation, and especially on the way that rights and obligations arise. Now, I'm just going to say a little bit about arguments based on the nature of the good before turning to what will be my own topic today, the kind of argument that is based in the nature of right and obligation. The most effective critics of the way we treat animals to date have been the utilitarians, and their argument is essentially an appeal to the nature of an animal's good. The other animals can experience pleasure and pain, therefore things can be good or bad for them in much the same way they can be good or bad for us. Since according to the utilitarians, the business of morality is the promotion of the good, the other animals plainly fall within its orbit. But appeals to the ways in which things can be good or bad for animals have also been used to justify the way we treat them. According to the type of argument I have in mind, there are differences between the character of human experience and the character of the experiences of the other animals that justify us, at least sometimes, in putting our own interests first. The most extreme view along those lines is, of course, the Cartesian view that the other animals have no conscious experiences, so that nothing can really be good or bad for them in a morally irrelevant way at all. But some non-Cartesians hold a view that seems to me to be not too far behind this. They believe that because the other animals supposedly lack any sense of their existence as extended in time, all that their consciousness can be is a series of discrete, disconnected experiences, which can be pleasant or painful or perhaps frightening or soothing, but only in a rather local way. Such experiences could not be connected in the way they are in us by memory and anticipation to long-term hopes or fears or any concern for an ongoing life. On this basis, some people have suggested that although we do have reason not to hurt the other animals, there is no special reason not to kill them when that suits our convenience and can be done without inducing fear or pain. Somewhat surprisingly, in my view, some of the utilitarians who have been such powerful champions of animal rights hold a view of this kind. In his commentary on Ketsy's The Lives of Animals, Peter Singer, for example, voices the common view that the fact that human beings anticipate and plan for the future means that human beings have more to lose by death than the other animals do. Singer imagines an interlocutor, he puts his daughter Naomi in this role, protesting that death for a non-human animal, for example, as their dog Max, would mean the loss of everything for that animal. And Singer replies that although there would be no more good experiences for Max, they could arrange for the breeding of another dog, and then this other dog could be having good canine experiences in Max's place. In other words, what matters is not the goodness of Max's experiences for Max, but just that there be some good canine experiences going on somewhere in the world. The trouble with this argument is that it depends upon a general utilitarian assumption which has nothing special to do with non-human consciousness. Utilitarians regard the subjects of experience in general essentially as locations where pleasure and pain, that is, good and bad experiences, happen, rather than as beings for whom the experiences are good or bad. To put the same point another way, they think the goodness or badness rests in the character of the experience, not in the way the experience is related to the subject that has it. This view of the relationship between subjects and the value of their experiences is in fact essential to utilitarianism, because it's what makes it possible to think that you can accumulate value by adding pleasures and pains across the boundaries between different subjects of experience. If the badness of pain were, as we might put it, tethered to its badness for a subject who experiences it, the badness could not coherently be added across the boundaries between subjects in that way. There is no one for whom your pain plus my pain is a bad thing. So if all badness has to be badness for someone, your pain plus my pain is not a worse thing than yours and mine alone, each alone. But the view that a subject's relationship to her experience is essentially one of location is, as I said, a quite general feature of utilitarianism, which doesn't have anything special to do with non-human consciousness. And this makes me wonder why Singer thinks that the fact that we have hopes and plans for the future makes death worse for us, or perhaps why he thinks it matters morally if it does. Memory and anticipation are in themselves just more experiences. And if a person is just a place where these experiences happen, then we can always replace one human being who experiences, say, satisfaction at the thought that his plans have worked out, or worry about the future of a loved one, with another human being whose experiences have similar content. In order to make the argument that there's a disanalogy between the death of a human being and the death of another animal, Singer would have to argue that because we human beings experience memory and anticipation, things can be good or bad for us in a way that goes beyond our being the mere location of good or bad experiences. And perhaps such an argument could be made, but in that case, it seems to me likely that Singer would have to give up utilitarianism, at least as applied to human beings. Now, I mentioned that argument because I want to make a more general point. Questions about what kinds of goods and evils an animal is subject to are of the utmost importance in thinking about how it is right or wrong to treat that particular animal. But when we're thinking about the general question whether human interests should take precedence over the interests of the other animals, the relevance of the difference in the kinds of goods to which we're subject is unclear. Utilitarians, and consequentialists more generally, believe that the way to determine what is right is by a calculus of utilities, by adding up the goods and harms done by an action, and choosing the action that does the most good. So if death is worse for a human being, they think human loss figures more largely in the calculus of utilities. And we can imagine someone trying to generalize this argument to show that human goods and ills are always so much more significant than those of the other animals, that human interests should always outweigh the interests of the other animals. That doesn't sound very plausible in its own right, but I think there's maybe even a bigger problem with it than that. I think there may be a conceptual problem with the very idea of an action that does the most good. Earlier I suggested that what's bad for me plus what's bad for you isn't bad for anyone in particular, and therefore isn't in any intelligible sense worse. If you believe that the goodness or badness of an experience, or anything for that matter, is, as I put it earlier, tethered to some subject for whom it is good or bad, then goods for different people or for different animals not only cannot be added up, they can't be traded off each other either. So even if it's true that death is worse for a human being than it is for a tiger, it may not follow that the death of a human being is a worse thing, period, than the death of the tiger. Because after all, for whom would it be worse? The death of a human being is very bad for the human being, but so is the death of the tiger for the tiger. If we have a duty to save the person in preference to the tiger, and I'm certainly not denying that we do, the grounds of that duty must perhaps be sought elsewhere than in the conclusion that the death of a person is a worse thing, period. Perhaps, for instance, the duty springs from expectations of a commitment to reciprocal protection among members of our species, or something of that kind. In a way, Singer's daughter Naomi is right. Any animal who dies loses everything that she has, and you can't lose more than that. So we shouldn't be thinking about doing, we should be thinking about doing the best we can for each animal, not about how things add up. Now, leaving these very large questions somewhat up in the air, I want to turn to a different approach to thinking about the nature of our ethical relationships with the other animals. A Kantian approach. This may seem unpromising because in the philosophical literature on our ethical dealings with the other animals, Kant is often cast as the villain of the piece. After all, Kant is one of the few philosophers ever to have said bluntly that human beings as rational beings are ends in themselves, while the other animals are mere means and may therefore be used for human purposes. And as I'm about to explain, Kant is one of the main proponents of a kind of argument, different from the ones I canvassed above, to the effect that the other animals are not proper subjects of moral consideration at all. This kind of argument is not grounded in the nature of an animal's experiences or in some supposed difference between human and animal good, but rather in the nature of obligation. The argument comes in various forms, but the basic idea is that morality is a system of reciprocal relationships, a system in which human beings mutually place each other under obligation. And the other animals, because they are not moral beings, cannot participate in such a system. They are therefore out of the scope of morality. And I think a similar argument might be used to deny that animals could conceivably have standing under positive law. Now, before I explain this argument and where I think it goes wrong, I want to say a word about why I think a Kantian approach can nevertheless be clarifying in this area. There are many ways in which people have characterized the essential difference between utilitarian or consequentialist moral thought and Kantian or deontological approaches. Often these characterizations proceed from the consequentialist point of view. For example, people sometimes say that consequentialists think it is always right to do what maximizes the good, while Kantians and other deontologists think, perversely it is implied, that sometimes we should not do that because there are side constraints on the promotion of the good. Or less polemically, it's said that deontologists think that some things are intrinsically right, apart from their consequences, and that this kind of value has priority over the good. But there's another way of thinking about the difference between these two kinds of theories that I think is deeper and goes more to the heart of the matter. This way of thinking about the difference is made available when we reflect on the meaning of Kant's formula of humanity as an end in itself. Kant's formula of humanity requires that we respect every human being as a rational being, as an end in itself. Now, I don't have time to review the particular arguments here, but Kant takes it to follow that you should never treat another human being as a mere means to your own ends, nor should you allow yourself to be treated that way. He thinks that the value of humanity requires us to avoid all use of force, manipulation, and deception because we must respect the rational choices of others and their free use of their own power of rational choice. He takes it to follow that all human interaction, as far as possible, should be on terms of voluntary cooperation and aimed at ends that can be shared by all concerned. And finally, he takes it to follow that we should help each other when we're in need and promote each other's chosen ends when we can easily do so. Now, the fact that this formula is intended to express basic requirements shows that the consequentialists and the Kantians really have a different view about what the subject matter of ethics is. Consequentialists take the subject matter of ethics to be the results produced by our actions, and take the main questions of ethics to be things like, what should we try to bring about? What should we make happen? How can we make the world the best possible place? Kantians, on the other hand, take the subject matter of ethics to be the quality of our relationships and interactions, both with ourselves and with each other. So Kantians take the main questions of ethics to be things like, how should I treat that person? What do I owe to him and to myself in this matter? How can I relate to him properly? What should our interactions be like? Now, of course, I'm not saying that either view ignores the other view's main question. But the order of dependence is different. It's a notorious fact, much discussed in the critical literature, that consequentialists try to derive what we might call the values of interaction from considerations about what does the most good. If you are allowed, say, to be partial to your friends and family and not required always to measure their interests against the good of the whole, that's because it turns out in some oblique way that people more efficiently maximize the good of the whole by attending to the welfare of their own friends and family. More generally, if you should be just and honest and upright in your dealings with others, consequentialists think, that's because that's what does the most good. It's less often noticed, but just as true, that in a Kantian theory, the value of producing the good is derived from the values of interaction. The reason that pursuing the good of others is a duty at all in Kant's theory is that it's a mark of respect for the humanity of another, that you help him out when he's in need, and more generally, that you help him to promote his own chosen ends. This is, among other things, why it's a serious mistake to characterize Kantian deontology as accepting a side constraint on the maximization of the good. Kant does not believe there is some general duty to maximize the good that is then limited by certain deontological restrictions. Rather, he believes that promoting the good of another and treating her justly and honestly are just two aspects of respecting her as an end in itself. Now, when we turn our attention to our ethical relationships with the other animals, this means that the ethical questions will look rather different than they do on a consequentialist account. The relevant question is not whether human interests outweigh the other animals' interests because of the special kinds of goods and evils to which we are subject, or conversely, whether the other animals' interests, because of their sheer number or intensity or gravity, sometimes do outweigh human interests after all. The relevant question is what, given their nature and ours, each of us can do in order to be related as well as possible to each of them. And of course, there'll also be questions about how, as a species sharing a planet and as a society sharing a territory, we should think of our relationships with the other animals. But before we can think about what it means to look at the ethical questions in that way, we must deal with the problem because, as I said before, it's Kant's official view that we don't owe the other animals any moral consideration at all. So now I'm going to turn to Kant's own views. Kant believed that there is one big essential difference between human beings and all the other animals. Human beings are moral and rational animals, and the other animals are not. Now, time constraints prevent me from explaining why one might believe that. So for today, I'm just going to ask you to accept that as an assumption and consider what might follow from it. What most obviously follows, of course, is not that we have no duties to the other animals, but that they have no duties to us. Why then did Kant conclude that we have no duties to them? Before I explain, I need to say just a little more about what Kant's views were. The views about the other animals that have made Kant notorious find their most famous expression in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, in his argument for the formula of humanity. In that argument, Kant first establishes that if there is a categorical imperative, that is a principle of reason that prescribes duties with categorical force, there must also be, as he says, I'm quoting, something the existence of which in itself has an absolute worth, something which as an end in itself could be a ground of determinate laws. He then proceeds to discuss various candidates for the end in itself, and in the course of that discussion, he says this: beings, the existence of which rests not on our will, but on nature, that is, beings we didn't produce, if they are beings without reason, still have only a relative worth as means and are therefore called things, while rational beings are called persons because their nature already marks them out as ends in themselves, that is, as something that may not be used merely as a means. Following the tradition of Roman law, Kant divides his metaphysical world into two exhaustive categories, persons and things. And if there were any doubt about whether Kant intends to include non-human animals in the category of things, those doubts are dispelled elsewhere. In his essay, Conjectures on the Beginnings of Human History, a speculative account of the origin of reason in our species, Kant explicitly links the moment when human beings first realized that we must treat each other as ends in ourselves, with the moment when we realize that we do not have to treat the other animals that way. Here's what he says. When man first said to the sheep, "The pelt which you wear was given to you by nature not for your own use, but for mine," and took it from the sheep to wear it himself, he became aware of a prerogative which by his nature he enjoyed over all the other animals, and he now no longer regarded them as fellow creatures, but as means and instruments to be used at will for the attainment of whatever ends he pleased. Now, because of this, it comes as something of a surprise that in spite of that remark, Kant himself did not think that it's morally permissible to treat the other animals in whatever way we please. Kant's own ethical views are reported in records of his course lectures and in his published book, The Metaphysics of Morals. Kant does think we have the right to kill the other animals, but it must be quickly and without pain and cannot be for the sake of mere sport. He does not say why we should kill the other animals at all, and the subject of eating them doesn't come up in his discussion, but it's presumably one of the reasons he has in mind. He does not think we should perform painful experiments on non-human animals, quote, for the sake of mere speculation, when the end could also be achieved without these, unquote. He thinks we may make the other animals work, but not in a way that overstrains their capacities. The limitation he mentions sounds vaguely as if it were drawn from the golden rule. We should only force them to do such work as we must do ourselves. And if they do work for us, he thinks we should be grateful. Kant sometimes told a story about the philosopher Leibniz carefully returning a grub he had been studying to the tree from which he had taken it when he was done. Quote, lest he should be guilty of doing any harm to it. And both in his lectures and in the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant has hard words for people who shoot their horses or dogs when they're no longer useful. Such animals should be treated, Kant insists, with, quote, gratitude for long service, just as if they were members of the household. He remarks with apparent approval that, quote, in Athens it was punishable to let an aged workhorse starve. And he tells us that, I'm quoting again, any action whereby we may torment animals or let them suffer distress or otherwise treat them without love is demeaning to ourselves. Now, Kant says little about how he derives these duties from principles. But it's worth noting that the duties Kant mentions here are not just duties to be kind or to avoid cruelty. Rather, they concern the ways in which we interact with the other animals, and the standards they set are as much standards of reciprocity as they are of kindness. We can make the other animals work, but not any harder than we would, and we should be grateful for their services when we do make them work. If they've worked for us all our lives, we should provide them with a comfortable retirement. Leibniz, we may be sure, did not go through the world making general efforts on behalf of the welfare of grubs. But he did want to make sure that the grub with whom he interacted was no worse for the transaction. Kant plainly thought that it's necessary to kill or hurt animals for some reasons, and we might disagree with him about what those reasons are. But he apparently thought that otherwise we should interact with the other animals as far as it's possible as we would interact with human beings on terms of reciprocity and mutual benefit. But as that last phrase I quoted suggests, Kant thinks that these moral duties are not owed to the other animals, but rather to ourselves. Treating animals without love, he says, is demeaning to ourselves. As he explains, violent and cruel treatment of animals is intimately imposed to a human being's duty to himself, for it dulls his shared feeling of their suffering and so weakens and gradually uproots a natural disposition that's very serviceable to morality in one's relationships with other people. In his course lectures, Kant made the same point by saying that non-human animals are analogs of humanity, and that we therefore cultivate our duties to humanity when we practice duties to animals as analogs of human beings. But if the other animals are indeed analogs of human beings, why don't we have obligations to them? Well, to see why, we have to turn to the argument I mentioned before, the argument that morality is a system of reciprocal obligation. What is what exactly does it mean to say that someone is obligated to someone else? According to one view, which Stephen Darwall and Michael Thompson have both emphasized in their recent work, in order for me to owe a certain kind of treatment to you, it's not enough that I am under the authority of a law saying that I should treat you in a certain way. This is the point I think might be relevant to questions about legal standing as well. Perhaps, for instance, I'm under the authority of a law saying that I should not deface beautiful paintings, but I don't owe that to the paintings. Nor is it enough to add that you should be the kind of creature to whom things can be owed. Rather, for me to be obligated to you, it seems as if we must be able to conceive ourselves as being under common laws, in the name of which we make claims on each other. For if you're obligated to treat me in a certain way, I should be able to demand that treatment from you, that is, to claim it from you as a matter of right. And I can only do this if we stand under the authority of the same laws. To see why, suppose that I'm a Christian, and the Bible says that I should be kind to all people, and you are a Muslim, and the Quran says the same. And suppose that each of us believes that our duties are somehow grounded in our faiths. Then I am duty-bound to treat you with kindness, and you are duty-bound to treat me the same way. But do we owe this to each other? Certainly, I cannot sincerely claim kindness from you as my right in the name of the laws of the Quran, since I don't concede any authority to the laws of the Quran. And you are in the same position with respect to me. So it may seem as if I owe it to myself and perhaps to my God that I should treat you with kindness, but that I don't owe it to you. And you are in the same position with respect to me. In this way, we arrive at the idea that for one person to owe something to another, in the sense that makes it claimable by that other as a matter of right, they must conceive themselves as being under common laws. Now, these ideas give us one way of understanding the role in Kant's moral philosophy of his idea that we form what he called a kingdom of ends. But before I can explain this, I have to back up and say a little more about Kant's idea about why we must regard rational beings as ends in themselves and what it means that we do so. Kant argued that it is a subjective principle of human action that each of us regards himself or herself as an end in itself. A rational being, he says, necessarily represents his own existence in this way. An end in itself, as I mentioned earlier, is something of absolute worth, something that can serve as the ground of determinate laws. Okay, so why does Kant think that it's a subjective principle of our actions, that when we act, we represent ourselves as ends in ourselves? Well, Kant believes that insofar as we are rational, we will pursue an end only if we take it to be good, by which I mean good absolutely and normatively, something that is worthy of pursuit and achievement in a way that could give rise to reasons for any rational being. Now, this is a slightly different notion of the good than the one I mentioned at the beginning, when I said that an animal is someone for whom or from whose point of view things can be good or bad. Something could be good or bad for an animal in that sense, without being good or bad normatively and absolutely. So when Kant says that we represent our existence as ends in ourselves, he's referring to the fact that we take the things that are good for ourselves to be good normatively and absolutely. That is, we take them to be worthy in pursuit of achievement. And I should add here, when I talk about things being good for ourselves here, I'm not necessarily talking about selfish interests. I'm talking about about whatever we would welcome given our natural concerns and dispositions. Our standing as ends in ourselves is a principle of our actions because we choose to pursue the things we judge to be in this sense good for ourselves, and it's only rational to pursue things that are good absolutely. So it seems that we take what is good for ourselves to be good absolutely. And when we take our own concerns to be important and worth doing something about, we are taking ourselves to be important and capable of conferring value on our ends through rational choice. As I understand Kant, this act of self-valuing, a kind of fundamental claim of self-respect that we make on ourselves and others, is a kind of original normative act that brings genuine normative value into the world. We can think of it as transforming what is only naturally good, good for you or me as a natural being, into what is normatively good, something there is reason for any rational being to promote. Kant pictures this as an act of legislation. You make it a law for yourself and everyone else that what you take to be good should be treated and regarded as good absolutely. That's part of the story about why every maxim we will must be fit to serve as a law, as the categorical imperative enjoins. Now, the idea of a kingdom of ends arises when we recognize that, as Kant puts it, every other rational being represents his existence in the same way, on just the same rational ground that also holds for me. Each of us asserts her standing as an end in itself for herself and all others, so together we form a kingdom of ends in which we legislate moral laws together. And in that way we can place one another under obligations. Kant explicitly argues that you can only be an end in itself if you can be a law-giving member of the kingdom of ends. So I think that this conception of obligation explains why Kant thinks we cannot have obligations to the other animals. The fact that I autonomously will a law that says that human beings are valuable and should be treated as ends in themselves establishes that I owe it to myself to treat you that way. But it's the fact that I conceive us as beings who share in reason to will this law together that makes me conceive it as a law for a kingdom of ends in which both of us are legislating citizens. And when I claim that you're obligated to me, I appeal to this conception of us as under the authority of shared or common laws, laws that we make together. But the other animals are not rational, cannot be legislative citizens in the kingdom of ends, and therefore cannot place us under obligations in the name of its laws. Only moral and rational beings, Kant thinks, can do this, and so obligations and duties can be owed only to them. Now, does that argument show that we cannot owe duties directly to the other animals? Let me make a preliminary point before I explain why I think it does not. At least in Kant's version, the reciprocity argument does not depend on any actual reciprocation. The idea is not that morality is a self-interested deal. You respect my rights and I'll respect yours, and then we'll both be safe from incursions from each other. The point is rather a normative one. We can make normative claims on each other only if we conceive ourselves as being bound by common laws. So the question is whether that is really the only way in which one can have a direct normative claim on another. Now, recall that the argument here turns on the idea that for you to be obligated to a being, it is not enough that you recognize the authority of a law whose content says that kind of being is to be treated in a certain way. If you recognize the authority of a law that says you must not deface beautiful paintings, it doesn't follow that you owe it to paintings not to deface them. But it doesn't seem to follow that the only way that I can be obligated to you is if you can actively make a claim on me in the name of the laws that we share. A perfectly respectable sense of obligated to might be given by our reasons for making the law, by who or what it is meant to protect. I am obligated to you if you are the source of the interests that the law I am under was made to protect. If we make a law against homicide in order to protect human beings, then violating that law wrongs human beings, not just the citizens who participated in making it. Whereas we don't really make laws against defacing paintings in order to protect paintings. We make laws against defacing paintings in order to protect the interests of those people whose aesthetic heritage includes those paintings. So we don't say that violating that law wrongs the paintings. If the law is made for your protection, we might say, then the violation of the law wrongs you, in the sense that it makes you the source of its obligation, even if you are not yourself bound by the law and therefore not in a position to make a claim in its name. It's still true that what the law ultimately demands respect for is you, your life or your interests, and so the obligation is to you. It also looks as if there's a difficulty to applying this thought in this case. This kind of argument depends on our having reasons for or against the laws we make. And in the case of positive laws, those reasons are perhaps to be derived from morality itself. But moral laws themselves are not laws made for instrumental reasons or to protect interests whose value has been independently determined. Moral laws are fundamental laws in terms of which we identify which interests are worth promoting and protecting. Nevertheless, I think that Kant's theory has the resources for answering this objection, and that he not only can, but must appeal to this sense of obligated to. And once we see why this is so, we will see not only that there is room in Kant's account for obligations to the other animals, but that we actually have such obligations. Now, according to Kant's theory, as I've argued, there's a kingdom of ends because each of us claims a kind of standing as an end in himself or herself, and that standing gives us duties to ourselves and to each other. As we've seen, Kant's story about that original claim, it's that it's built into the very nature of rational action. There's a way in which it's almost impossible not to make the claim, because in a sense, just by the act of making a rational choice, you confer normative value, not only on the end that you choose, but also on yourself. But the self that confers that value and the self on whom it is conferred are not precisely the same. The self that confers the value is your autonomous rational self, your law-making self. But the self on whom value is conferred is not just the autonomous rational chooser, it is rather the self whose interests are in question, the self for whom, or from whose point of view, things can be good or bad. For the way that you assert your standing as an end in itself is by legislating that what is good for you or from your point of view is indeed to be counted as an absolute good. And the self for whom things can be good or bad is not, or rather is not just, your rational self. It is your animal self. Now there are two ways to make this argument, one weaker and one stronger. The weaker way is just to observe that among the interests we protect through our moral legislation are interests that spring from our animal nature, not from our rational nature. Our objection to pain and suffering is an obvious example. You will a law, say, against being made to endure suffering as a means to the ends of someone else. This is not just because respect for your own autonomy demands that you should be allowed to decide for which ends you're prepared to suffer. It is because of that, but not just that. It's also because you object to suffering. That's why the question for which ends you are prepared to suffer comes up for you in the first place. To see this, consider that when you decide that some end is not worth your suffering for, your own decision cannot be based on respect for your own rational autonomous choice, for at that point you have not yet made any rational autonomous choice that's there to be respected. That's what you're doing at that moment, making the choice. Instead, it has to be based on your taking the view that your suffering, which is a bad thing for you, is a bad thing absolutely, and bad enough not to be endured for the sake of this other person's end. So although being rational autonomous beings, moral lawmakers, is what enables us to make normative claims on ourselves and each other, the content of those claims cannot be given completely by respect for rational autonomy itself. That view necessarily leaves out the relationship of self-respect in which you stand to yourself and the way that it governs your own choices. Part of what we confer value on when we respect ourselves is certain interests we have not as rational beings, but simply as sentient ones, such as the interest in avoiding suffering. The stronger way to make the argument is just to say that since the original act of self-respect involves a decision to treat what is good or bad for you as something good or bad absolutely, the self on whom value is conferred is the self for whom things can be good or bad, and the self for whom things can be good or bad is your animal self. Since our legislation is universal, it deems animals to be ends in themselves. Now, a common reply to the argument put that way is that it might only be the good of rational autonomous beings on which we're conferring value. But that reply seems unmotivated, or rather, it seems motivated only by the desire to block the conclusion that we have duties to animals. And it also seems disingenuous. When you object to your own pain and suffering, it's not because the pain and suffering of a rational being seem like a bad thing to you. It's because the pain and suffering of a being who can suffer seems like a bad thing to you. Now, according to the argument I've just sketched, the sense in which we owe duties to the other animals is slightly different from the sense in which we owe duties to other human beings. The other animals cannot make claims on us under laws that govern us both. Rather, we see them as falling under the protection of our laws, and we make claims on ourselves on their behalf. To that extent, Kant was perhaps right to think that our duties to the other animals arise by way of our duties to ourselves, or anyway by way of our relationship to ourself. But he was wrong to think it follows that our duties are not owed to them. Instead, I think what I've called the fundamental claim of self-respect, the claim that brings the moral world, the kingdom of ends, into existence, and our recognition of the claims of the other animals are both responses to the same thing, to the predicament of being a being for whom things can be good or bad. As animals, we're beings for whom things can be good or bad. That's just a natural fact. When we demand to be treated as ends in ourselves, we confer normative significance on that fact. We legislate that the things that are good or bad for organisms, for whom things can be good or bad, should be treated as good or bad normatively and absolutely. That's why we have duties to the other animals. And I want to conclude by saying just one word about the consequences. I've claimed that all animals are ends in themselves, and that this is a commitment that's inherent in our own rational volition. Part of the reason why people resist the idea that they really have any such commitment is that it looks as if the duties that would result from such a commitment are going to be enormously burdensome and perhaps a little bit preposterous. So now it's important to reiterate that on a Kantian account, the focus is on interaction. We are not under an obligation to maximize the good of all sentient beings, because according to Kant, we cannot add values across the boundaries between different animals, and so the idea of maximizing the good makes no sense. Of course, it would be good if we could make things good for each and every animal, but that is obviously impossible, because in a world founded on the principle of predator and prey, the interests of the other animals are necessarily at odds with each other. Now, I think this is a point worth emphasizing. I was once at a conference on animals where the participants discussed the question whether, were it in our power, we should try to eliminate predation from the world altogether. This sort of question makes the mind reel, and I think that as a matter of psychological fact, it also makes some people reel away from thinking seriously about their obligations to the other animals. Such questions arise naturally for utilitarians, who think that the main question of ethics is how we can make the world as good as possible. And I'm not saying we shouldn't ask such questions. I think the answer to the question whether we should try to eliminate predation from the world is no, as a matter of fact. But we can eliminate predation from our own lives, and I think that we should. And this is because on a Kantian account, we remained under an obligation to interact with the other animals as far as we possibly can in ways that are mutually beneficial and fair, even if we can't fix the world. That isn't too much to ask of ourselves, especially when the interactions in question are ones we compel the other animals to take part in. It's simply a matter of reminding ourselves that we and the other animals share a very strange fate. We are homeostatic organic systems, although ultimately ephemeral ones, for whom things can be good or bad. Thank you.
Just wondering, how would this fall into your definition of thought process? As if say, non-human animal, say a lion versus an antelope, there's no thought, or if they're acting in instinctual survival modes, that there's no thought of the lion acting upon the antelope. There's no thought, as far as I know, that the lion is thinking about his effect on the antelope for survival. So if in that instance there's not that interaction, and as far as Kant's concerned, how would his thoughts or our obligations to those who don't act in a rational fashion, why would our obligation to them be the same?
Well, actually, the view I was putting forth at the end of the paper suggested that simply when a lion is engaged in interaction with an antelope, there is no particular duty of ours on the scene. We're not obliged either to help the lion catch the antelope or to help the antelope to get away. The duties the Kantian system gives us are duties to interact with animals ourselves as far as possible on terms that are reciprocal and fair.
I think maybe I'm mistaken, but if the animal world doesn't show the same considerations to each other, why would we as animals be obligated to show those considerations to other non-human animals?
Well, because when we ourselves make demands on ourselves and each other for consideration, and say that others are obligated to respect certain facts about ourselves, I'm claiming that among the things that we demand that others respect about ourselves is things like our capacity for pain and suffering. And therefore, we must respect those capacities where we find them.
Yes.
How does your philosophy guide decisions we make when we have set two different species on a conflicting course? For example, when we look at feral pigs that are eliminating some species because humans have brought pigs to an island or something like that, how do we make decisions about guiding the survival of one species at the expense of another?
I wish I knew. I think it's one of the hardest problems in the area is the fact that sometimes, largely as often as a result of ways in which we ourselves have messed up the balance of nature, we then have to move in and say, cull a species to keep that the damage that's been done from going any further. I think there's a way in which I think those decisions, hard as they are, do have to be made, and they have to be made, you know, what we have to look to is how we actually can restore the balance of nature so that we don't have to go on making decisions of that kind. But those are moments in which it certainly would have been better had we stayed out of it so that we didn't put ourselves in that position. But I have no good way of, you know, making it look more palatable.
Anton?
Yeah, I was wondering how much it mattered to the plausibility of the upshot that you were claiming at the end, that we're omnivores. I mean, if a lion could talk, it would still be a carnivore. It would still not be able to live on salad. Its life form wouldn't be compatible with that. It still might make claims, let's say, on other members of the pride, that they respect one another's capacity, you know, act in a way that shows respect for one another's capacity to suffer pain. But it wouldn't, I mean, it's hard, it does not seem plausible in that case, or it doesn't seem, I can't see how morality could require these animals to die by not eating what they need to eat.
And I'm not saying that it does. For one thing, I mentioned under Kant's view that Kant thinks there are some reasons why it can be necessary. kill an animal. I mean, this other question has mentioned one, when we've upset the balance of nature and we have to kill something in order to get the balance restored. I also think that if it were absolutely biologically necessary for us to eat meat, then it would be okay for us to eat meat. I would still think we had to reduce the cruelty of it in any way we could. But then it would be okay for us to eat meat. And I think that, you know, sometimes it can also be necessary to kill an animal when you're faced with an infestation of some kind of pest. So I sort of think our species has something like a right of self-defense. So I'm not saying in that situation, you know, if there were rational lions, that they would have an obligation not to eat meat. But if there were both on this planet, rational lions of my persuasion and rational apes like ourselves, the lions would really envy us because it's open to us not to have to do this horrible thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the acceptability of pets. So if we sort of own these animals and live with them, but in a sense we're denying them what would be this whole range of interactions that are in their nature. And even if we do treat them in a loving, kind way, and almost in a reciprocal way, we're still denying them in a way what would be their nature if we wouldn't own them.
Right. Different kinds of cases. First of all, in this discussion, I want to take dogs off the table because it really is their nature to live with us. That's how they evolved. I mean, they didn't evolve to be pets, but they evolved to live with human beings and work with us. So they're not part of the question. There's more of a question when we take other kinds of animals that really have a natural life apart from us and force them instead to have a companion life for us. As I said, my view is sort of that when we force interactions on animals, this can be okay as long as there is mutual benefit and fairness to the relationship. When we take in companion animals, yes, we do deprive them of certain features of their natural life. There are also benefits for them. They get medical care. You don't get that in the wild. You know, they live much longer, and we provide for them a life that is in different ways, as far as we can tell, satisfying to them as well as filling this great, strange craving for the company of the members of other species that only our species suffers from. So I think it's okay to have pets. I mean, I think it has to be the kind of animal that can sort of get some satisfaction out of living the life of a sort of permanent human infant rather than whatever it's going to be. But there are animals who seem to get enough satisfaction. So I think it can be okay. Yeah. Yes, Steve.
Yeah. Excuse me. Chris, I just want to try to defend or motivate a more conventional, more orthodox interpretation of the form of humanity here at that discussion. And unless I may have missed a step here, but because I want to motivate the suggestion that I think you dismissed as ad hoc. So I'm a rational agent. I don't want to suffer pain, and in doing so, I take that to be a worthwhile thing, not to suffer pain. And you said that commits me in some way to the thought that my pain is, I think, absolutely bad, in a way that then would apply to pain in the case of animals. And the suggestion, I take it, that you rejected was, well, in thinking that pain is absolutely bad, I mean pain for rational agents, or pain of rational agents. Am I?
Well, that was the thing that I thought was unmotivated.
Okay.
It was just the pain of rational agents that was bad. It just seems to me that isn't what we're thinking when we think that.
Well, okay, then that is the thing I wanted to motivate.
I mean, or there's another way to motivate it, you know, which is through these arguments about the good that I mentioned earlier, to try to show that because of the supposed discontinuity of their experience.
No, I'm not appealing to any of that. So here's the attempt to motivate, to keep this restricted to rational agents, is the thought, look, my thought that pain is bad the thing I'm supposedly implicitly committed to, right, is the thought that pain is such that my aversion to it is a correct aversion, right? As a rational creature, I choose correctly in being averse to it.
Correctly?
Yeah, it's something worth being averse to. My attitude is responsive to the real character, right? This isn't an arbitrary aversion. It's something that's responsive to the real nature of the thing I'm aversive to. I'm trying to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, this, I don't want to accept that description of it, the situation, for a couple of reasons. One is that I'm seeing the moral story as I tell it here. Not so much as an epistemological story about recognition and stuff, but as a way of getting normative volition into the world, and there being certain ways we have to do that. So it's not a matter of recognition. The other thing that runs interference with here, and I have to apologize to members of the audience who have not read my other work, although not today because he has, but my own theory of pain and the sources of normativity makes, you know, it's not that you're correct to be averse to pain, rather you're in pain when you're having an experience you're averse to.
Okay. Let me just try it, granted that. A different way of motivating it then. So I feel pain, and in some sense, for you, I take it to be what I'm doing is important. In some way which commits me to the thought that pain is absolutely bad. But I'm thinking, well, the reason in thinking that it's absolutely bad, in the sense of now legislating that, I think that's a notion, creation or legislation, is that that's the sort of thing that demands recognition, right? I'm setting forth as demanding recognition from other rational choosers, well, from others who might question me about what I'm doing, who I might offer justifications to, who I might try to enter into a common project with and talk about what's worth doing. I mean, that's sort of where talk of reasons and justifications you want standards for these kinds of interpersonal negotiations. But those are things rational agents engage in. And you might think that's precisely what an animal, or at least lots of animals, snakes, don't engage in. They don't ask us for justifications. They don't engage in argument. They don't suggest new possibilities. They don't engage in collective endeavors and argue about the points of those things. So you might think this is the non-ad hoc motivation, but the whole talk of legislating value is relative to a certain, use the phrase, form of life, right, that involves challenge, talk, resentment, certain forms of emotional and social interaction, which animals just aren't into. And so that would be why whatever this legislation is, the scope of it remains relativized to creatures who are like that.
That seems to me to be a more elaborate way of denying that what I was referring to as the second sense of can be obligated to can work. It's a way of insisting on the original reciprocity argument, but expanding it out to talk about justification and things like that.
Jonathan.
Could I ask you just a little bit more about pets? There's something, I'm not sure what I think about this, but there's something feature about pets that troubles me, which is not just that we, live with them or keep them, but that we breed them. And the question is really about we breed orchids into things that couldn't possibly exist in other than these very hothouse special conditions. And we do something similar with some of our pets, that they're bred into these extraordinarily, rarefied creatures that could only exist, by being extraordinarily dependent upon us. And there's something, I sense that there's something wrong about that, that we shouldn't be doing the same thing with animals that we do with plants. And related to that I think it's just a related question. So my question is, what do you think about that? That's why you took dogs off the table, and I sort of want to put some dogs back on the table.
Well, I just want to put dogs off the table as to the question whether it's okay for them to live.
Right, but I just want to
That's
say,
just what they do,
you might be able to
right?
say about a certain species, look, they just wouldn't exist if it weren't for us. But what's the moral implication of that? Is that a grotesque fact or a wonderful fact? And let me just ask one more thing, this related question, which is, I mean, suppose we could sort of intentionally breed out of a specific species of animals all the things that make us think we are obligated to them, so that we could eat them with impunity, as it were. Wouldn't that act, even though you might say there's no, so that we get very plant-like animals by our breeding practices. You might say, well, there's no animal along the way. By the time we're eating them, there's nobody we're obligated to, or no big creature we're obligated to. But wasn't there something wrong with the whole process, or do you not think that's so? I mean, those are two related questions.
Okay. In the case of dogs and the fancy breeding, I'm sort of dependent on us isn't exactly what I want to focus on, even though I'm in sympathy with your point. The points I made at the beginning of the talk about what an animal is and how it has capacity for good and bad depends on a certain view of an animal as a functional unit. An animal has good insofar as it's a coherent functional unit. And the thing we do to dogs is we make them like self-undermining. We actually breed into them properties that interfere with their own functioning, so that they hurt all the time, if their legs are too short and things like that. And I certainly think that's bad, because to make a creature that's capable of good or bad, but then to make it so incoherent that it gets bad coming and going, then that's really bad. Yes, so that I think is bad. And I suppose you could regard being made dependent on us as an interfering functioning, partly just on grounds of prudence. They might get out and have to depend on themselves. And so, yeah, I do think that's bad. Now, as far as the other thing you said about breeding out of animals, the attributes that make us want to, I think one thing I want to say is if you describe it a different way, it doesn't sound so awful. We do some gene splicing to enable plants to grow more protein, and that seems okay, right? But then it's a question whether you're imagining this process merely as one that involves the creation of a new plant-like species, or one that involves bringing an end to some other species. And that seems to matter in the scenario too. Then I would have, in that case, I would have the same objection to it, which I mentioned in the paper. I had an objection. I didn't say what it was, to the people who want to end predation altogether, which is, it seems to me, there are deep questions about personal identity involved here, but it seems to me that if an animal is so essentially a predator that it wouldn't be itself anymore, you're not doing it any favor by breeding predation out of it. So as far as I'm concerned, this proposal amounts to a proposal to get rid of half the animals in the world.
And there are several people waiting by now, and Gabriel will come back to you. But Brian?
I want to ask you a question about poor old Max the dog and the implications of the argument for Max. So let's just take the weaker version of the argument. You say those interests include interests that spring from our animal nature that we share with the other animals, therefore our moral laws protect those interests. I take it that the aspect of our animal nature that counts here is roughly sentience, the capacity to experience pain and suffering, and so the moral law would in fact protect that interest insofar as we share it with other animals. Now go back to Max. So Max has this same capacity for sentience, right? Therefore this same kind of interest in avoiding pain and suffering. But suppose we painlessly kill Max, so we don't cause him any pain, and now he no longer is sentient, and therefore can no longer experience pain and suffering. So is it wrong on your view to painlessly kill Max, or do you end up in the same place with Peter Singer?
I don't end up in the same place with Peter Singer. There's a longer version of this thing in which I talked about that more. But no, I think that once an animal is alive, you are wronging it by depriving it of good experiences it would otherwise have had. If you kill it, it's deprived of good experiences it otherwise would have had. I don't see any reason for blocking that conclusion, and unless you accept that most dubious of all moral principles, what you don't know can't hurt you. So I don't agree with Singer about that.
Gabriel.
So this is way going back to David's question and also just maybe a request for clarification of the argument. So am I right in thinking that your idea is that, okay, there's one story in Kant about that insofar as we're agents, we are committed to taking our desires or interests as prima facie reasons for us, and then we recognize that the same is true in other people, and how that story is supposed to work is actually just a side issue for the argument in this paper, right? And whether or not that works doesn't matter so much, because it's just the point is just that I myself, insofar as I am an agent, am somehow obligated to myself qua animal. Is that right? Because insofar as I'm an agent, I must take my desires as prima facie reasons for me, but those desires are springing from my animal nature. Is that?
Yeah, that's.
And then you have to go on and tell a story about, okay, so if my animal nature is a reason for me, then the animal nature of other people gives a reason, other agents gives a reason to them. So maybe actually, no, I'm wrong. So now, what I don't quite understand is why you don't need why the part of the story about mutual reason giving. It's the fact that it's a reason for them that I have to respect it. The fact that the animal nature gives the other people a reason. Isn't that crucial to Kant's story about how I become obligated to other people, must take them to be ends in themselves? And so that since animals aren't agents, then their animal nature doesn't give them a reason, and it doesn't have to, therefore doesn't give a reason to me. What am I missing here?
In the case, let me start by saying something else. I think it's a sort of problem with Kant's theory as written, that he sort of has, well, you have moral incentives, and then you have incentives that arise from the rest of your nature. And if there's no particular moral incentive in the way, then you act on the other incentives. But the other incentives are portrayed as just things that kind of happen in you. And you can look at this whole story and think, why do you act on these other incentives? If they're just these things that impinge on you, the urges you have that you have no reason to